Hello everyone, and thank you so much for coming to this talk on an alternative history of art. I'm Naomi Polonsky, I'm the art assistant at Newhall Art Collection. The collection was started in the late 80s as a way of addressing the historic imbalance between male and female artists who are represented in museums and galleries. Now it's the largest collection of art by female artists in Europe and the second largest in the world. And we continue to believe in the need to tell a different and more female story of art to the one that you see in most museums. Most of our works were created between the years 1950 and the present day, but today Katy will be talking about what happened before that. In 2015, Katy set up the Instagram page, The Great Women Artists, where she posts about female artists, past and present, from emerging artists to established ones, from recent art school graduates to old masters, and always in a fun and accessible way. It is regularly cited as one of the top art Instagrams, and it has an ever-growing following. I think when we started planning this talk a couple of months ago, had around 29,000 followers. Now it's more like 35,000. Clearly, this is a story that not only needs to be told, but one which people also want to hear and see. Katy also regularly curates exhibitions and organises residencies for female artists. She's all round a bit of a star, so please join me in welcoming Katy to the stage.
Thanks, Naomi. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Is it on? Great. Thank you so much for coming today. So as Naomi said, my name's Katy Hessel. I am an art historian, curator, and founder of the Instagram account, The Great Women Artists, which celebrates female artists on a daily basis, ranging from young grads to old masters to unearthing the forgotten artists who so many people don't know about. It also looks at women working in a variety of mediums, from painting, sculpture, photography, film, etc. To tell you a bit about the exhibition, the Instagram account, it was set up in October 2015 as a reaction to the lack of female artists I knew about, but also female artists who I sort of saw in museums and galleries, etc. What really prompted me was actually studying the work of Alice Neel. I'm not sure if many of you guys are familiar with her. She was an American portrait artist, very much working at a time when the abstract expressionists reigned in New York City in the mid-century America. So, not only did she make me realize that she was just a portraitist in an abstract expressionist-dominated world, she was a woman in a man's world, which got me thinking about all the other repressed female artists that must be out there. So also, Alice Neel was the painter of the late and great Linda Nochlin, who penned the essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists, in 1971, which my blog also cites. The account also very much came into existence because I'd been to an art fair in October 2015 and I hadn't seen a single artwork by female artists. I'd also just been studying, and I felt that history of art was often maybe written in quite an elitist way, so I wanted to sort of break that down and create a platform which I think Instagram sort of lends itself very well to, which kind of has digestible knowledge about history of art. And it was also a way to put my knowledge to good use. So the reason why I want to talk to you about women artists 1550 to 1945 today is because before I started the account, I probably couldn't name 20 women artists off the top of my head, let alone historical ones. It wasn't actually until I wrote an article on Renaissance and Baroque female artists that I even considered that they were even artists from this time. Who were these artists? It's not like women artists didn't exist before the 1970s. They've been artists for centuries. We even have records dating back to the 11th and 12th centuries with Hildegard of Bingen, who was born as early as 1098 in Rhine. She was known for her advanced illuminated manuscripts full of images triggered by her sort of visionary experiences, and she was also later made a saint. So what I want this talk to provide is an insight into how women contributed to the history of art, starting with the Renaissance and ending with the pre-war Surrealists and mid-century outsider artists. I'm not just going to focus on the path we've always known. I'm also going to divert to lesser-known artists, artists working in the sort of non-Western history of art canon, and just prove, basically, how women were consistently breaking boundaries. So the history of art is often described by a few names. It started with Giotto, Botticelli, Titian, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Caravaggio, Bosch, Bernini, Rubens, Rembrandt, David, Ingres, Friedrich, Delacroix, Turner, Monet, Manet, Van Gogh, and Degas. And I can assure you that probably everyone knows every single one of those names in this room, or most of them. But what if I told you the following names? How many do you think you'd recognise? Angra Sola, T-Link, Fontana, Van Hemesen, Surrani, Leicester, Peters, maybe Gentileschi, Miriam, Royce, Kauffmann, Vigée Lebrun, Cabot Perry, Bonheur, Bell, Brooks, John, Valadon, Stettheimer, and Delaunay. All major, all important artists in their own historic right, but totally underrepresented in the history of art. I even checked my Gombrick quite recently, flicked to the back to have a look at his sort of overview timeline, and not a single woman artist featured, quite shockingly. But you know, stats like this have been brought up before. The Guerrilla Girls, I'm not sure if you guys heard of them, they're a sort of artistic activist collective who found that women artists make up of only 3 to 5% of major permanent collections in the Europe and US. The National Gallery in London has just acquired their 20th artwork by a female artist, Artemisia Gentileschi's self-portrait of Catherine as Alexandria, which they acquired for £3.6 million, although that's not really much compared to Leonardo's Salvador Mundi, which fetched for $450 million about a year ago. But it's interesting because actually in the periods I'm going to talk about first, the Renaissance, women were actually making as much, sometimes if not even more, money than their male counterparts. So why haven't we heard of them? And why aren't there enough female artists in major collections? You know, surely looking at the history of art from a male perspective has got to be in balance. Is it because there have been no women artists? No, there have been loads and loads of good ones. It's because women artists have either been written out of our history or purely forgotten. But even the fact that I'm standing here today, rewriting them into art history, shows that there are loads. And I have about 45 minutes, so I'm going to make it quick and kind of highlight just some of the really prolific ones. Also, you know, you have to realise that it was so much harder for women to even become artists. They were banned from apprenticeships, and also the fact that our historians didn't even address the gap until 1971 with Linda Nocklin's seminal essay. So the Renaissance. Being a female artist in the 15th and 17th centuries was unsurprisingly very difficult. Leading male artists would refer to themselves as virtuoso, which translates to mortal god, whilst women were widely overlooked and given few opportunities to create, but they still did. The women who I'm going to talk about today weren't fazed by the fact that critics called the painter's brush more manly, or the fact that they were sort of referred to as the more passive sex. They fought back, developing innovative painting techniques and teaching and inspiring the younger generations. Some had huge contemporary success, but why haven't they been remembered? Lavinia T-Link was born in Bruges to an artist's father and mastered a unique facet of portraiture. She was a prolific miniaturist. Her meticulously crafted portraits caught the eye of one patron in particular, King Henry VIII, who invited T-Link to live in England, acting as the court painter. She succeeded the late Hans Holbein, who had previously been paid a considerably lower salary. She went on to produce intricate objects of desire, as seen in this portrait of Queen Elizabeth as a young teenager. Plautilla Nelli is known as the first Florentine female Renaissance artist. She was a self-taught nun who was one of the first female artists mentioned as Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Painters. She created large-scale religious scenes full of vivid emotion on her characters' faces and was the first woman in history to tackle the ambitious composition of the Last Supper. Her 7-metre version hangs in Santa Maria Novella in Florence. There was also Catharina van Hemesen, who was a Flemish painter whose distinctive works were known for including plain clothing, solemn expressions, and dark backgrounds. And while these characters may seem not very flattering for her sitters, she was nevertheless a very prolific portraitist. She was the first artist to paint her self-portrait at an easel, as seen in this work, which is inscribed, "I, Catharina van Hemesen, have painted myself 1548, here, age 20. I'm sure to prevent any male artist stealing her work," more on that later. And with a signature forlorn face, she chose to immortalise herself as a woman who worked. So perhaps you haven't heard of those artists. Of course, they were lesser known, but the real star of the Renaissance, she's housed in collections such as the Uffizi and the artist who transformed portrait painting, breaking down boundaries, but also switching up gender conventions in her own work, was Sofonisba Angra Sola. She was born in Cremona in 1532 into a noble family and held titles such as the Spanish court painter. Very rare for a woman of her time. She received a lot of recognition during her lifetime and was praised by the likes of Michelangelo and Vasari. But luckily for her, she was encouraged by her father, who actually wasn't an artist, although that's the way female artists would get apprenticeships. He actually raised her almost like a son because he didn't have a son until his 7th child, and by which time Sofonisba was already a painting sensation. She was a very clever and witty painter and began painting at a young age under Bernardino Campo, who she paints here. She was clearly a firm feminist for her time, as she almost tricks the viewer at first with this work because you think it's him dictating her appearance. But not only has she painted herself nearly 1.5 times as big as him, she's actually the one dictating his appearance, dictating her appearance. And not only that, she's got him painting the kind of meticulous robe section of her painting, which was actually normally assigned to an apprentice. She worked exclusively as a portrait artist because women artists in that time were restricted to this kind of more duller genre for the fact that they kind of weren't able, or artists didn't think they were capable of taking on these kind of big history portraits. However, being the very clever and witty woman that she was, she used all her power to develop these paintings and interwove genres such as landscapes or religious scenes or conversations or kind of playfulness into her work, which was how she got round it. Lavinia Fontana was also a Bolognese-born artist who was known for her highly ornamental and intricate portraits of the upper-class Bolognese people, as we can see here with Bianca degli Utelli Marcelli with 6 of her children and dogs. And as you can see, she was also a kind of renowned for painting dogs as well. Flemish-born Clara Peters was the first woman ever to have a retrospective at the Museo del Prado in Madrid in 2016, after the director's wife asked, why have there been no female artist retrospectives? So what might look like still lives at first, with wines, breads, fruits, all delectably spread out on a platter, Peters goes the extra mile to make her so to think. She's playing with the idea of presence, something that Velázquez very much thought about a few decades later, and you can actually spot her in the, you can spot these kind of small self-portraits in her goblets, in these kind of jars and bowls and everything, as if she were demanding to be seen, but also that no man would be able to steal her identity, which they often did. So there's an insight into the Renaissance artists, the women who paved the way for future female artists and went on to break boundaries and painterly conventions in a completely new way. But now I'm going to introduce you to the Baroque artists at a time when Caravaggio ruled and painting was being taken to the most highly dramatized place, with its often violent and passionate subject matter. And it was arguably the Naples-born Artemisia Gentileschi who ruled this era. She was born on the cusp of the Baroque era and is one of the few artists whose career is globally and widely known today, being likened to her contemporary Caravaggio. She broke boundaries for women and was always causing controversy. She created highly dramatic and sometimes extremely blood-ridden violent scenes that some considered more striking than any painted by a woman before. Many might attribute this, however, to her sexual assault, which occurred at the tender age of 19 by an older teacher and friend of her artist father. And although this shouldn't override her formidable skills as a painter, she was known for projecting herself into scenes of powerful women, many of whom were exacting revenge. With a career that spanned a staggering 40 years, Gentileschi's canvases were never timid. In the past, scholars have even argued that it was hard to believe that these works were by a woman, although her triumphant portrayals of biblical and Roman heroines was seemingly unlikely to be painted by a man. Her determined, psychologically advanced depictions of Judith and Lucretia were embedded with stunning light effects, and her monumental stance in self-portrait as St. Catherine of Alexandria shows a strong, determined woman with her left hand resting on a wheel adorned with vicious metal spikes. However, there is a sort of slight look in her eye that's looking to the past or a distant memory. Another Italian contemporary for this time, from Bologna, was the artist Elisabetta Surrani. She was a believer in plain living and high thinking, her words for working precisely and quickly. Surrani was already supporting her family by age 19. She churned out over 200 works in her very all too brief career. By her mid-teens, she had already outpaced her teachers and earned herself commissions by the Grand Duke Cosimo de' Medici. She was also a teacher to more than a dozen students in the city of Bologna, but she tragically and suddenly died aged 27. Some scholars believe this was from working too hard, and others believed she was poisoned. But whilst alive, she dedicated her canvases to striking biblical and allegorical scenes featuring women. Her parents of Mary Magdalene and Dahlia are portrayals of bold women, but it's Portia wounding her thigh in this work here that highlights a breakthrough depicting the courageous woman in a calm and virtuous pose. Over in the Netherlands, artists such as the Dutch Golden Age painter Judith Lisa was expanding painting into a new era of brash brushstrokes, a style far beyond her time. Her bright, jolly portraits of musicians, often mid-song and sometimes mid-drink, displayed psychologically charged facial expressions of sitters who were often paired with still-life subjects and objects. She was one of two female members of the Haarlem Painters Guild in 1633, and she also often found herself involved in drama with one of their most notable artists, Frans Hals. Not only did she file a complaint after he stole one of her assistants, but centuries later, in 1892, a court case addressed an issue with what was supposedly a Frans Hals painting that had been sold to the Louvre. The court found that the painting, which had received praise from major critics, was in fact signed with the initials JL, which was more proof of her leading star status. But they weren't just painting biblical or historical scenes, although just speaking about the development from portraiture with the Renaissance to these kind of historical biblical scenes shows how much progress was even made in that small amount of time. So another Dutch Golden Age painter, born slightly later than Leicester, was the botanist Rachel Royce. She was born as early as 1664 and was better known for her highly skilled botanical masterpieces. She was also a contemporary of Rembrandt, and it is known that her still lifes during the Tulip Mania era, where floral works reached astonishing heights, were sold for over double his, despite women painters being extremely overlooked in the 17th century. There was also Maria Sibylla Merian, an artist and naturalist who was born just a few years earlier in Germany. She travelled extensively. Bear in mind, this is the cusp of the 1700s, exploring all corners of the most northeastern coast of South America, where she recorded the most exotic flora and fauna that documented the nature of metamorphosis, and thus contradicting contemporary ideas about how insects developed. She also discovered unknown animals and insects, and her classifications of butterflies and moths are still, in fact, used today. Moving into a more classical and Rococo era, Rococo was a very highly ornamented style popular in the 18th century Europe, especially in France. It was characterized by pastel colors and sinuous curves, and reacted against the Baroque style. Rococo artists favored a more intimate and mythological scenes and light-hearted depictions of pleasure-seeking. Of course, most people identify the Rococo with Fragonard's fantastical scenes or Watteau's large paintings of the upper classes kind of doting around their country manners, but women artists also dominated this period too. Artists were also often part of an upper-class set, but Venetian-born Rosalba Carriera was born into a modest family nearing the end of the 18th century. She was self-taught and began her career painting miniature portraits on snuff boxes. She focused on everyday activities of women and mythological themes connected with women's lives. After gaining fame for her portrait of Antonio Zanetti, her snuff boxes also evolved into portraiture, for which she pioneered the exclusive use of pastel. Her go-to was porcelain skin, flushed cheeks, and wavy hair with subtly blended pastel colours, creating a soft, velvety surface. Fans included the kings of Denmark and Poland, who all clamoured for portraits by her. In her career, she moved to Paris, where she painted the likes of Watteau and was elected a member of the Academy. also very rare for a woman of her time. But sadly, in her later life, she went under 2 unsuccessful cataract surgeries and ended up losing her vision completely. But of course, she is remembered for pioneering the way as a strong influence for also many of the women artists that came after her, such as Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun and Angelica Kauffmann. Born in 1741 in Switzerland, Angelica Kauffmann was seen as a child prodigy. She specialised in history subjects and grand portraits and was very much influenced by and associated with the neoclassical style. She began her artistic career in Rome aged 23, where she was immediately became one of the members of the Roman Academy. Soon after, she headed for London, where she was one of 2 women, the other being Mary Moser, who were the founding members of the Royal Academy of Arts in London, despite the institution not actually allowing women artists until 1860, shockingly nearly 100 years after it had opened. This image here by Johann Zoffany depicts the founding RAs, and you can see Kauffmann and Moser are actually immortalised as marble busts because they can't officially be members, despite the fact that they were founding members. However, we definitely know that she did try and hope that female students would one day be admitted. Pictured here is Kauffmann's 1778 work Design, which sees a female figure studying the very same torso that was used for the students at the Royal Academy schools, which obviously only males could go to. This work here, Colour, depicts an unrestrained female stealing pigment from a rainbow. Again, her figure is copying the antique male nude statue, commonly known as the Belvedere torso, which again was restricted for men. A French classical painter you may not have heard of, but might perhaps seen a very famous portrait by, is the artist Marie Denis Villiers. After hardly being known throughout her lifetime, Villiers went to take painting lessons with the most famous neoclassical artist, Jacques-Louis David, at the turn of the 19th century. And for those Linda Nochlin fans in the audience, have you ever wondered why this portrait here might be on the front cover of the 1971 issue of Art News that initially published Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? Historically, this painting was described by critics as the most perfect, unforgettable picture, and was even bought by the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York for a staggering $200,000 as early as 1922, when it was under the impression that it was painted by David. A few years later, discussions arose, and art historians decided it was actually not by Jacques-Louis David, but by Villiers. Of course, critics were outraged but more by the fact that they had sort of praised this woman's work, and certain critics have even said that although the painting is extremely attractive as a period piece, there are certain weaknesses of which a painter of David's calibre would not have been guilty. I'm not so sure about that, but the Met rightly attribute it to her and has been heralded as a feminist piece ever since. Other notable classical painters include the prominent French portrait painter of the late 18th century, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun. She was known for her grand portraits full of wispy brushstrokes, depicting details of opulent clothing and lavish settings. Vigée-Lebrun made a name for herself serving as the portrait painter to Marie Antoinette, where she tried to revolutionise the Queen's look to the public, portraying her in a more human and relatable setting. However, I still think she looks as kind of ostentatious as possibly can. Vigée-Lebrun created some 660 portraits and 200 landscapes in her lifetime, one of which is actually part of the National Gallery's collection. Elizabeth was also the teacher of Marie-Guillaume Benoit, a French neoclassical historical and genre painter whose style emulated both Vigée-Lebrun and Jacques-Louis David. She won commissions such as painting Napoleon, but her ties weren't always aimed towards politically important figures. In 1800, she exhibited this portrait here in the Salon in Paris. 6 years previously, slavery had been abolished, and this image became a symbol for women's emancipation and black people's rights. And this picture was later acquired by Louis XVIII for France in 1818. Moving throughout the 19th century, there were also other prominent female painters who came to pioneer realism. Realism was very much a rejection of Romanticism and was an artistic movement that began in France in the 1850s after the 1848 revolution. It was particularly the great Rosa Bonheur who became the poster woman for this movement. She was trained, again, by her minor landscape artist father, and she relocated from her original home in Bordeaux to Paris in 1829 after specialising in paintings of animals. She was so committed to this subject that she regularly dissected animal parts obtained by the local butcher and went to slaughterhouses on the outskirts of Paris as a teenager. She was adamant to observe animals as closely as possible, and as a result, her reputation grew and she was already exhibiting in the Paris Salon by age 19. Now, I do realise that many of the artists I have discussed are white and of European descent, which is why I want a detour to tell you about a little-known quilt maker, but one of my favourite artists, working in America at the same time as the French realists, Harriet Powers. Harriet Powers was born into slavery in 1837 in Georgia and was African-American descent and was known to be one of the finest quilt makers to have lived throughout the 19th century, with her works depicting scenes from biblical stories, local legend, sometimes even astronomical events. She learned the craft of sewing whilst on plantation, and she always used traditional techniques when creating her hand-sewn squares that made up of over 200 squares per quilt. Across the other side of the world was Katsushika Oi, another name you will immediately recognise when I say her father's name, Hokusai, one of the most celebrated artists in Japan. An accomplished artist in her own right, Oi supported and worked as Hokusai's collaborator during the final 2 decades of his life. She was also an assistant to him, he was also a huge admirer of her talent at the time when he created the Great Wave. Her notable works include painting this work here. It's a painting on silk of the legendary warrior Guan Yu, who is depicted as having his arm bled, as you can see here, to remove poison away from an arrow. And although this image kind of might be quite shocking for its day, if we looked beyond the action at the centre of the painting to consider the entire work, we come to admire how much she has juxtaposed the violence of his ordeal with the order of the interior. We note how the room and its elements, with its straight columns, elegant furniture, and the still life of food and drink in the background, is designed to provide a counterpoint of quiet against the controlled chaos. Thought to have been born around 1800, Oi excelled at handwriting and paintings of beautiful women. She was also very close to Hokusai throughout her entire life. Her name even actually translates to daughter or woman, but she curiously disappeared after his death and was never really heard of again. Back in Europe, the Pre-Raphaelites were very much ruling the second half of the 20th century. And although the Pre-Raphaelite movement was predominantly known as the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the British but Greek-born Maurice Bartelli-Stillman was a firm member of the movement. She exhibited throughout her extensive 6-decade career, and in typical Pre-Raphaelite fashion, she depicted scenes from Petrarch, Dante, Shakespeare in wispy and delicate and poetical realist style in a total of about 170 paintings. At the turn of the century, when the Parisians were tearing brushstrokes apart in Paris, which I'm about to come to, over in Austria, there was one last glimpse of romanticism, with Klimt leading the way. But ever wondered who might have inspired his sweeping lines? After visiting the MacDonald sisters' sensational exhibition at the Secession in Vienna in 1900, where they were treated like royalty after their sellout show, Klimt spotted the intricate and opulent work of one sister in particular, Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh. Filled with elegant women swept up in gold dreamscapes, her gold plates were the inspiration behind Klimt's later work, especially his 1907 masterpiece, The Kiss, and portrait of Adele Bloch-Bauer. So who was this woman? Again, you may have heard of her husband, Charles Raleigh Mackintosh, Glasgow's most celebrated architect. She was a very skilled artist in her own right and worked in a variety of watercolour, metalwork, embroidery and textiles. Her break very much came throughout the end of the 19th century, when a group of women were, for the first time in history, admitted to the Glasgow School of Art. Margaret was one of 4 female students, along with her sister Frances, who were instrumental in the evolution of the decorative and interior style known as the Glasgow style, which the city still very much pays homage to. Over in Paris, with the rise of education offered to women, women were also becoming instrumental in contributing to some of the most contemporary and radical styles. The rise of film, with the likes of Edward Muybridge, influenced movement in painting, and subjects began to be more about rural life and everyday rituals. But despite being studied with the frustrations and rejections of the Impressionist group, Bert Morisot went on to be known as the Grand Dame of Impressionism, due to her quick touches of colour and free handling of paint, animated faces and brushstrokes. And for a long time, she was even considered sort of more highly regarded than than her male counterparts, Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro. Her American counterpart was Mary Cassatt, who settled in Paris in 1873 from Pittsburgh in America. Her signature subject included portraits of women in intimate portrayals of mothers and children caught in everyday subjects. Cassatt's work combined the light colour palette and loose brushwork of Impressionism. She felt strongly that painting needed to break free of the past and old methods and adapt to the modern world. And although her work was considered feminine by critics, she was also controversial and commented on gender conventions throughout her life in Paris. Her masterpiece, this work here in the Loge, first appears as depicting a beautiful woman in a theatre box, a common subject for her kind of contemporary Impressionists. But look again, and you see Cassatt as giving her female figure a noticeably more dynamic role. Not only is she kind of standing on her own in her own box, but in the background in the upper left, a man trains his gaze upon her, as you can see there. The viewer, who sees them both, this is us, completes the circle, and her painting explores the very act of looking, breaking down the traditional boundaries between the observer and the observed, the audience and performer. But whilst these brash, thick and wispy brushstrokes were sort of on the rise in Europe, there was one Swede at the same time as everyone, as the Impressionists, who was silently changing the course of modern art long before anyone else. Ask yourself, who do you think is known for inventing abstraction? Normally considered a movement that boomed in the 1920s with the likes of Mondrian, Malevich and Kandinsky, abstraction was in fact first pioneered in 1906 by a little-known Swedish artist called Hilma af Klint. She was born into a Protestant family in 1862, and she abandoned the traditional conventions of painting after study at the Academy of Fine Art in Stockholm. And along with 4 other women, nicknamed the Five, she began painting the invisible worlds hidden within nature and twisty diagrams that represent her complex spiritual ideas in her bright and bold canvases. They also experimented in automatic writing and drawings decades before the Surrealists. However, she was afraid that her painting style would not be understood, so worked in near isolation from the European avant-garde throughout her whole entire career. And it wasn't until 40 years after her death that her paintings were shown to the public for the very first time by a Finnish art historian at a conference in Helsinki in 1984. She is now known as one of the true pioneers of abstraction and is currently celebrated in a retrospective at the Guggenheim in New York at the moment and has been recognised globally. But it's so sad to think that she never sort of would know what she would have achieved and the effect that she had on the artists to come. So colour was also bursting onto the scene with Fauvism, brushstrokes becoming heavier, thicker, and colours stronger as a reaction to Impressionism. German-born Gabrielle Monta was known for using vibrant colours with her distinct painterly style, whether it was her Fauvis landscapes with burning skies or primitive portraits with a thick black outline to encompass each colour. Monta was always interested in the spiritual associations of colour. There was also Paula Modersohn-Becker, born in Dresden in 1876. Again, she has been celebrated in an exhibition in Manchester this summer with Chantal Joffre. She was an expressionist turned Fauvis who broke boundaries by being the first woman artist to paint nude self-portraits. She was known for her vibrantly coloured, intense and thick brushstrokes, which famously influenced Picasso. Modersohn-Becker's life was sadly cut short, aged 31, just 19 days after her first child was born, which she longed for her whole life and painted as a subject throughout her work. Emily Sharmi was an anomaly amongst the French Fauvists for her beautifully soft and sensual portraits. She cared more about the modern woman's personality than a man's fantasy, as seen in this portrait was in the 1822 Parisian exhibition. Circus performer turned artist model turned artist Suzanne Valadon, who often sat for the likes of Degas and Renoir, pioneered painting with her strong, candid female nudes that revolutionised the concept of the female gaze. Living throughout Montmartre's pinnacle era of beauty and bohemia, Valadon also was impressively the first woman painter admitted to the Société Nationale des Beaux-Arts. Dada was also a movement that defined itself on not defining anything at all. It was born out of a mutiny against World War I and the social and political climate that fueled it. The artists associated with this movement proclaimed themselves as progressive. However, it could be easily argued that they took a blind eye to their female artists. Like many movements, women were the object. They were the muse. But the following artists I'm going to tell you about definitely were not the muse and did not consider themselves as the second sex, particularly Hannah Hoch, who was arguably the leader of the women Dada pack. She was an early pioneer of photomontage and mass media appropriation and part of the most political branch of the movement, having based herself in Berlin. She made a name in her signature artistic style by splicing bits of newspaper imagery for political satire. But as mentioned, she didn't let anyone get away with calling her the second sex. She was a fierce feminist who used art to draw attention to women's issues such as birth control and suffrage, issues very bold for a woman to stand up to in the 1920s. It is known that before she became an artist, she worked in publishing, making sewing patterns for women's magazines, which brought her attention to the extremely sexist advertising, something that artists Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger have since picked up on. These ads fueled Hoch's desire to stand up to the commercial construction of femininity, and she succeeded. In 1920, she exhibited at the Dada Art Fair in Berlin and penned the story The Painter, a tale about a husband who descends into a personal crisis when his wife requests he does the dishes 4 times in 4 years. And then maybe the most interesting of all is Baroness Elsa von Freitag-Loringhoven. I'm guessing many of you haven't heard of this rather peculiar but highly eccentric performance artist. Well, have you heard of Duchamp's Fountain, the supposed artwork that sort of defined or marked the start of the ready-mades in modern art? Truth be told, Elsa was a great friend of Duchamp around the time of this era-defining work, and often painted amusing portraits of him. In 1917, she penned a letter to him, telling him to create an urinal as an artwork, and signed the letter Armat. So was it really a woman who invented modernism? Another movement that emerged during the same time as Dada was constructivism. And like Dada, being characterized by World War I, constructivism was born out of the Russian Revolution. It questioned the fundamental properties of art and asked what its place should be in a new society. The constructivists challenged the idea of the worker's art as a unique commodity, explored the more collective ways of working, and looked at how they could contribute to everyday life through design, architecture, industrial production, theatre, and film. Along with Rodchenko, Popova was a pivotal figure in the Russian avant-garde movement, and her experimentation produced some of constructivism's most innovative works. Popova's overlapping planes of painterly architectonics, as she called them, created dynamic interactions between shapes and colours on both abstract and semi-figurative paintings, often to three-dimensional effect. The constructivists compared the artist to an engineer, arranged materials scientifically and objectively, and produced art as any other manufactured object. And it was an art that transcended gender differences. The equality of the sexes was an important communist principle, and this was one of the first periods in history, maybe the only period in history, where female artists were valued as highly as their male counterparts. Did you also ever know that there was a great English constructivist who rivaled the likes of Mondrian? Born in London to Jewish parents in 1889, the always androgynously dressed Marlowe, previously Marjorie Moss, abandoned the Slade School of Art and fled to Paris for some European modernism in 1927, where she worked under Leger and became a founding member of the Abstraction Creation, along with the likes of Jean Arp and Mondrian. Majorly influenced by Mondrian's neoplasticism, his signature geometric style, Moss also influenced the Dutch artist with her linear, mathematical double-grid compositions. But whilst the women of Europe were pioneering their artistic styles, there were 2 major artists from Brazil and India who were also defining their country's style. Amrita Sher-Gill once said, "I can only paint in India. Europe belongs to Picasso, Matisse, Braque. India belongs to me." Despite a short-lived career, she passed away at age only 28. The Budapest-born artist was one of India's most prominent and advanced painters in the first half of the 20th century, often referred to as India's Frida Kahlo. She had a passionate sense of colour and empathy that speaks through her vibrant portraits of everyday scenes in India in the 1920s and 30s. Brazilian artist Tarsila do Amaral goals was to be the painter of her country, which was Brazil. and she is still known, after having made a retrospective again at MoMA earlier this year, as being one of the most prolific South American artists of her time by painting what her country was: primitive buildings and unconventional cities where skyscrapers were not yet built, mirroring Brazil's primitive soul. She combined Brazilian modernism with the Cubist language after studying in Paris and with the palette and subjects of her hometown of Sao Paulo. Tarsila's style is very much a cross between Cubism and Surrealism, so let me tell you a little more about the women in Europe and America who dominated the movement that has inspired so many artists working today. Of course, we have all heard of the female Surrealist artist and cultural icon Frida Kahlo, who has since she died in 1954, age only 47, became a global sensation with her self-portraits that referenced her other presence. However, women across the globe have dug deep through Surrealist painting in order to discover the depths of their dreams and unconscious. Helen Lundberg was one of California's most significant Surrealists and rivaled the French as she penned the only US manifesto to challenge André Breton, the self-proclaimed founder of Surrealism in Paris in the 30s, which pointed towards a more pure psychic automatism. Unlike her European counterparts, Helen's paintings offer up a more rational approach to Surrealism that are known to carefully reflect on the mysteries of biology, astronomy, and physics. But Surrealism wasn't just about paintings kind of losing themselves in these lucid and fantastical dreams. Artists such as Mary Oppenheim brought them alive with her signature fur-covered dishware. A friend and contemporary of Breton and Max Ernst, and also famously worked as a photographic muse for Man Ray, Oppenheim transformed everyday objects into symbolic references which point to society's exploitation of the female body. Gertrude Abercrombie often included her penchant for the moon or black cats or mysterious women in her paintings that are often set against a dark, dusky background with a hint of spark of fluorescent colour. She was very much involved with the Chicago avant-garde and the Chicago jazz movement in the 1940s and 50s. Again, she's also had a major exhibition in New York this summer. At the start of World War II, the Spanish-born Remedios Varo fled Franco-Spain and the Nazi-occupied Paris for Mexico, a place that allowed her to define her own witty sense of surrealism, meticulously drawn figures in a highly stylized and nondescript background full of spiritual curiosities. Leonora Carrington had a very interesting story that actually wasn't very far from home. She was born in Lancashire in the UK and had a career that spanned 7 decades after she fled from her aristocratic family, who excommunicated her from the family after they found out she was an artist, and moved to Paris. Here she began a great passionate affair with Max Ernst and exhibited at the International Exhibition of Surrealism in 1938. And after World War II, she too fled to Mexico, where she mastered a magical realist style. But there were also those artists who were living amongst the war in Europe at that time. Hannah Reigen, an anti-fascist Norwegian tapestry maker's work, were made in response to the political events of the 20th century. Again, she was also had an exhibition of modern art Oxford earlier this year. Born in 1894, the little-known Swedish-born Reigen worked utterly from scratch in a remote Norwegian seaside town using the wool that she spun from her sheep. Having lived throughout both world wars and been personally affected by the Nazi occupation of Norway, her husband was imprisoned. Reigen's work portrayed a puppet-like Hitler, a bullish Winston Churchill, and a square-faced Mussolini with a bolt through his neck. Lee Miller was also the Vogue model turned surrealist photographer turned war correspondent. In 1940, she started taking pictures of the war for British Vogue and soon after became the magazine's war correspondent, flying to France, from them to publish Miller's dispatches on the field hospitals in Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the death camps of Dachau, and the banality of when she went to go visit Hitler's apartment in Munich, where she took photographs of herself in his bath. But before I end, I want to speak about 2 outsider artists who hardly have had any recognition today, but who are slowly becoming highly influential artists with their work that I feel is probably some of the most contemporary today. Aloise Corbaz was born in 1886 in Switzerland and was an outsider artist and prominent figure of the Art Brut movement. She had always dreamt of being an opera singer until she left Germany in 1911. It was here where she became a teacher at the court of Kaiser Wilhelm II, whom she developed an obsessive romantic passion. When World War I kicked off, she was sent back to Switzerland, but her imaginary romance with the Kaiser continued, as constantly referenced in her vibrant and passionate drawings, which eventually led her to being diagnosed with schizophrenia, and in 1918 she was put in an asylum where she remained for the rest of her life. In 1920 she began her primitive and erotic drawings in secret, where she would frequently be visited by Jean Dubuffet, who, over the course of 2 decades, gave her the recognition she deserved. Over here, we have the self-taught outsider artist Madge Gill, who created thousands and thousands of meticulously crafted ink drawings that reflected her obsession with spiritualism. She was born an illegitimate child in 1882 in East Ham in London and spent her early years in seclusion, and by age 9 she'd already been placed in an orphanage. After sadly giving birth to a stillborn at age 37, Gill began to create a flurry of drawing activity that was guided by a spirit. Her beautiful and packed drawings that reach up to 30 foot wide, as seen in this work here, often featured a young woman dressed in flowing robes, but no one ever knew who this woman was. Perhaps her unborn child, or perhaps her spirit. But throughout her life, she passed away in 1961. She never sold any of her works for the fear that it would anger her spirit. So although there are tons of women artists I haven't covered, I hope that this talk gave you an insight into who the women artists were who contributed to the art history in the 16th to 20th centuries. But what I'm still baffled about is where they are in the world's collections and where they are on view, unlike here, where we have one of the largest collections of women artists in the world. You know, it's really time museums made a change and dug deep into reinsert women into the history of art, which I have proven wouldn't really exist without some of the key ideas that stem from artists such as Baroness Elsa von Freytag-Loringhoven or Margaret MacDonald Mackintosh, in exactly the same way that the scientific world wouldn't be advanced as it was without figures such as Marie Curie or even Maria Sibylla Merion's drawings of insects. My aim is not to say that women artists ruled over men, of course they didn't, but it's important to show and remember who they were in order to gain a balanced understanding of art history as a whole. Art is a conversation, and we need to keep it flowing to remember who paved the way before us, as in every industry. I hope you can go away from this talk and feel inspired to look up some of these artists more thoroughly to make sure that their legacies endure forever. Thank you.